I remember the day I married Rachel as if it happened yesterday. We were standing under the oak tree in her grandfather's backyard, exchanging vows with sweaty palms and pounding hearts. She wore a simple lace dress that hugged her figure perfectly, while I fidgeted in a suit I borrowed from my brother because I couldn't afford a better one. That day felt like a blessing, like every hardship and heartbreak I'd endured before was just leading me to that moment. I was sure that I'd found the woman with whom I would share my entire life. Children, a house with a yard, maybe a dog or two. For years, we were solid, or so I thought. But now, as I sit here alone in this half-empty living room, I realize how little I truly knew about the woman who claimed to love me. Everything changed when she disappeared. It wasn't like her to skip out on our plans or ignore my calls. She was always organized, borderline obsessive with her schedules. If I came home 5 minutes later than usual, she'd already be pacing around the living room, wondering if something had happened. So, the first night she never came home, I filed a missing persons report out of sheer panic. I couldn't reach her by phone, her friends hadn't heard from her, and her office reported that she had abruptly requested a leave of absence. Days bled into weeks, and my worry morphed into fear and anger. Where was she? Why didn't she say anything to me? I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I spent hours driving around the city, checking every motel, hospital, and police station, desperate to find her. My mind began to conjure up wild scenarios. Maybe she was kidnapped, or perhaps she'd met with an accident. The police told me they had little to go on, no signs of forced entry at our home, no suspicious activity on her bank statements, and no ransom calls. Meanwhile, my parents urged me to stay strong, to consider therapy, or at least lean on friends for support. But the truth is, I started to hate anyone who gave me hollow words of comfort. I was drowning in questions, and no one could throw me a lifeline. My mind wandered back to every conversation Rachel and I had in the last few months. Had she dropped hints? Did I miss some subtle clue that she was planning to leave me? I found myself replaying our last argument about something trivial, whose turn it was to buy groceries. She had been uncharacteristically quiet afterward. Now, I wondered if she'd already been plotting her escape, even while I was cluelessly planning our next weekend getaway. 3 weeks crawled by with no word. I felt the hollowness of each passing day like a physical ache in my chest. Then, one Sunday morning, as I was dragging myself through the front door after a sleepless night, I saw her. She was sitting in the kitchen, her hair disheveled, wearing the same clothes she'd left in weeks ago. My heart raced with confusion and relief, followed by a surge of rage. "Where have you been?" I shouted, voice cracking under the weight of my pent-up fear. She glanced up, her eyes filled with an emptiness I'd never seen before, and offered no immediate explanation. Instead, she asked if I could get her some water. That request felt like a slap in the face. I wanted answers, not domestic chores. Yet, I obliged, because despite everything, I still needed to know she was physically okay. When she finally spoke, she admitted she'd gone away to clear her head. No explanation about where or why, just a vague mention of needing space. I was too tired to fight, too drained to question her further in that moment. I paced around the kitchen like a restless animal, collecting my thoughts, wondering if I should call the police to let them know she'd returned. Then, without warning, she grabbed my arm and mumbled something about a confession. My pulse quickened. A confession to what? My mind raced through every possibility. Was she pregnant with someone else's child? Was she addicted to something? Had she killed someone? I braced myself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for the words that came out of her mouth next. "I've been cheating on you for 4 years because I was bored." I almost dropped the glass I was holding. I stood there, silent, for what felt like an eternity. 4 years! That was nearly half our marriage. She sat with her head bowed, tears streaming down her cheeks, as though she expected me to comfort her. The twisted irony made me sick to my stomach. Questions peppered my mind. Who was it? How did it start? Did all those nights I fell asleep next to her mean nothing? Instead of unleashing my fury right away, I found myself eerily calm. I pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and asked her to explain. She stammered through a series of half-baked excuses. She felt unfulfilled. She wanted excitement. She didn't know how to talk to me about her dissatisfaction. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears, feeling as if each word was a fresh betrayal. And then, in a tone disturbingly devoid of shame, she said, "But I want to come back now." Her audacity was staggering. Come back now, as though she'd merely gone on a brief vacation without telling me. My jaw clenched and my fists tightened under the table. But I refused to shout. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I told her to leave, to get out of the house she had so thoroughly desecrated with her betrayal. She begged, claiming she had nowhere else to go, that she realized her mistake and wanted to fix our marriage. The gall of her words ignited something fierce inside me. Yet, a cold, detached part of me took over. I repeated, calmly, that she needed to leave. Her tears fell harder, and she tried to reach for my hand. I recoiled as if her touch were poison. Eventually, she gathered her keys and stumbled out the door, leaving me with nothing but the stench of her confession. For days after that, I lived in a fog. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The woman I had shared nearly a decade with had just confessed to a 4-year affair and vanished once again. My phone buzzed incessantly with her calls and texts, each message more desperate than the last. She proclaimed she loved me, that she'd made a mistake, that she was willing to do anything to prove it. But every time I thought about responding, I remembered how calmly she'd admitted that she was bored. It gnawed at me, the idea that my love, my devotion, had been so insufficient that she sought thrills elsewhere. I didn't know how to handle the breadth of my fury. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and worst of all, ashamed. Ashamed for not seeing it sooner, for trusting so blindly, for letting myself become a fool who never questioned his own wife. At some point, anger replaced my despair. I told myself I needed answers, not just from her, but from whomever she had been seeing. I wasn't sure how to find them, but I started by going through her phone records. It was surprisingly easy. I remembered her login credentials from the time we had merged our cell phone bills. The first number that appeared repeatedly over 4 years belonged to a man named Gregory. I didn't know him personally, but I recognized the name vaguely from a company event Rachel had dragged me to. He'd been the guy who kept winking at her during the presentation, though I brushed it off as my imagination at the time. My heart pounded as I continued scrolling. The calls were constant, often at odd hours. Even more damning were the text messages, hundreds of them per month. My stomach churned as I realized the depth of her betrayal. I wrestled with the idea of confronting Gregory directly. Part of me wanted to march into his office and beat him senseless. Another part, the calmer side, insisted that the real blame lay with Rachel. She had been my partner. She was the one who vowed fidelity. Still, I felt an undeniable pull toward vengeance. Something in me refused to let this go without a fight. I didn't want her back, not after everything, but I wanted them both to taste the humiliation I was drowning in. I started tailing Gregory, memorizing his schedule, even hacking into his social media to get a sense of his personal life. He was single, living in a condo downtown, and had a string of casual flings. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became that my wife had chosen such a shallow man to throw away our marriage on. One evening, I found myself outside Gregory's condo. I had no clear plan, just a furious need to face the man who'd been sleeping with my wife for 4 years. My hands trembled as I rang the buzzer. He answered, sounding mildly annoyed, until I said I was there to talk about Rachel. Silence followed, then a buzz granting me entry. When he opened his front door, I saw confusion in his eyes, as though he'd never expected me to show up in his life this way. I walked in, ignoring his offer to sit. I told him I knew everything, and I demanded to hear his side. To my surprise, he didn't deny it. He didn't try to shift blame or sugarcoat anything. He admitted they had an affair, said it was casual fun at first, then turned complicated. As he spoke, I felt my rage boil over. I lunged at him, and though I'm not a violent person by nature, I couldn't stop myself. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. He didn't fight back, just held up his hands, pleading for me to calm down. Something about his willingness to accept the beating made me pause. He said he knew it was wrong, but that Rachel had always insisted I was distant and unambitious. Those words stung more than any physical blow could. I backed away, breathing hard, my knuckles throbbing. My mind reeled as I wondered if Rachel had told him I was worthless, so her betrayal seemed justified. He mumbled an apology, insisted he hadn't seen her in months. I stared at this stranger who had upended my life and felt an emptiness that frightened me. Without another word, I left, my head pounding with a mixture of fury and despair. Days turned into a haze of legal consultations and tense phone calls from Rachel. She insisted we meet in person, claiming she owed me the full truth. Morbid curiosity compelled me to agree. We met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, neutral ground where neither of us had any memories. She arrived looking worn, guilt etched across her face. But I refused to pity her. I was past pity. I was past heartbreak. I wanted to hear her justifications, to catalog each lie, each rationalization. She recounted how the affair started as a drunken fling at a work conference. She claimed she regretted it immediately but found herself drawn to the danger, the thrill of hiding something. Over time, it became routine, and she admitted she stopped feeling guilty. Boredom, she repeated, was her reason. My mind reeled. The mundanity of our life wasn't enough for her. She wanted more adrenaline. I listened, letting her pour out every detail, my face betraying no emotion. But inside, I seethed. She begged for another chance, argued that she now realized how much she loved me, how much she valued our life. My thoughts drifted to the years I spent saving for our first home, the nights I massaged her tired feet after her long shifts, the mornings I made her breakfast in bed. Was any of it real, or was I just a background character in her search for constant excitement? As she wept, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as though I was watching a movie. "We can rebuild," she said, her eyes shining with desperate hope. I asked her if she'd have confessed at all had she not gotten bored of Gregory. She froze, and in that moment, I knew her tears were less about regret and more about losing her comfort zone. I stood up, ignoring the curious stares of a few patrons who'd overheard fragments of our tense conversation. I told Rachel I had no intention of forgiving her, that we were done. The anguish on her face was immediate, but I felt no satisfaction, only the hollow ache of finality. I reminded her that she'd broken something that couldn't be fixed, that her boredom had cost us everything we had built. She begged, even tried to grab my hand, but I jerked away. I walked out of that cafe, letting the door slam shut on her pleas. Outside, the sky was overcast, a fitting backdrop for the storm raging inside me. My phone buzzed with her frantic texts. I deleted them all without reading. A new kind of resolve took shape within me. There would be no reconciliation. She'd made a choice, and now she would face the consequences. I threw myself into the divorce process with a singular focus. I gathered evidence of her infidelity. Emails, text messages, phone records, everything I could find. I wanted to ensure there was no doubt about why this marriage was ending. My lawyer commended my diligence and advised me that in our state, the details of adultery might influence alimony decisions. Good, I thought. She didn't deserve a dime. Rachel tried to talk to me multiple times, showed up at my workplace once, even cornered me in the parking lot, but I brushed her off. I felt a flicker of guilt every time I saw her tear-streaked face, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her 4-year secret. Meanwhile, I blocked Gregory on all my social media, not that he reached out anyway. I suspect he wanted to forget the entire ordeal as much as I did, or perhaps more. As the court date approached, Rachel's pleas grew more frantic. She left handwritten letters in my mailbox, pleading with me to consider counseling, to think about the good years we'd had. I was unmoved. The only good years that mattered were the ones she hadn't used to lie and cheat. On the morning of the hearing, she showed up with puffy eyes and an air of desperation. My lawyer presented our evidence, and Rachel didn't contest it. The judge, seeing the clear grounds for divorce, set forth the final decree. I watched Rachel as the judge spoke, noting the tremble in her hands and the tears slipping down her cheeks. Maybe in another universe, her sorrow would have awakened empathy in me, but not in this one. The gavel came down, and with it, our marriage officially ended. She whispered something to me in the hallway, but I pretended I didn't hear. After the divorce, I was left with a strange sense of emptiness. I'd spent so much energy preparing for the battle that once it was won, I wasn't sure what to do next. Friends tried to cheer me up, inviting me out for drinks or to set me up on dates, but I wasn't ready. My trust in love was shattered. Late at night, I'd replay the moments of betrayal over in my mind, feeling a dull ache settle in my chest. Sometimes anger flared again, but mostly, I just felt numb. That was until I discovered one final bombshell. Rachel had not only cheated, but had, in fact, tried to push for promotions at work, by cozying up to higher-ups, Gregory among them. One of my acquaintances at her company spilled the beans after too many drinks, saying how everyone suspected she used personal relationships for professional gain. My blood boiled anew. In that moment, I knew my revenge wasn't over. I compiled every incriminating text, every rumor, and every hint of her manipulations at the office. Then I sent it all, anonymously, to the company's HR department and several executives. Word spread quickly. Rachel was investigated for misconduct and eventually let go. Her reputation in the industry took a lethal blow. I never saw her again, but I heard she moved back in with her parents, struggling to find stable work. The knowledge of her downfall felt like a final stroke of justice. I let go of the anger I'd harbored for so long, knowing she'd reaped what she sowed. Moving on wasn't easy, but I did it without regrets. She'd chosen her path out of boredom, and in the end, I found a new beginning. One forged from self-respect and peace. From the earliest days I can remember, my parents made it clear that my younger brother, Connor, was the golden child of our household. While they insisted they loved us both, their actions consistently favored him. He got the nicer gifts at Christmas, extra praise at school recitals, and enthusiastic support in every endeavor. Meanwhile, I learned early on that I had to fend for myself. My father would wave me off whenever I tried to share an achievement, dismissing my success with a half-hearted nod. My mother, though kinder in her tone, always found a way to tie my accomplishments back to Connor's so-called potential. It was like they were grooming him to become some prodigy, and I was just an accessory in the background. Perhaps if I had accepted that dynamic quietly, life might have been simpler, but I always believed in my own worth, which put me at odds with them. I strove for self-respect, chasing small victories wherever I could find them. I participated in sports just to show I could excel at something on my own. I studied hard to earn scholarships and never had to rely on them for college tuition. Growing up in my own household felt like battling an uphill war with no reinforcement from anyone in my corner. By the time I was 18, I had decided to get as far away from that environment as possible, forging my own path in the process. College became my refuge. It was the first place where I felt entirely free, judged only by my own actions rather than in comparison to Connor. I was no longer the older sibling who didn't quite measure up. Instead, I was an honors student majoring in finance, someone who landed an internship at a well-regarded firm downtown. Those years turned my life around. I relished the independence of being on my own, making decisions without having to second-guess how my family would react. When I met Lisa at a study group, I was immediately drawn to her calm intelligence. She had a gentle smile and a focused ambition that matched my own. We spent late nights in the library, comparing class notes and occasionally joking about our future plans. Back then, I believed in forging a partnership grounded in mutual respect and shared goals. We connected over a shared love of detective novels, a passion for traveling, and the dream of someday owning a cozy house in a quiet suburb. Her presence felt like a promise that I could build a family different from the one I knew. Within a year, we were inseparable. On our graduation day, when I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, her applause sounded the loudest. My parents attended the ceremony, but they were more excited to mention Connor's new achievements to anyone who would listen. Lisa noticed the tension and comforted me later, promising we'd make our own happiness together. I proposed to Lisa a year later, after we had both established ourselves in our respective careers. She seemed delighted, and we moved to a modest apartment in the city, close enough to my office so I could walk to work. I'd always promised myself that once I was settled, I'd help my parents if they ever needed it, despite our rocky history. But they never asked for my support. They were too busy celebrating Connor's acceptance into an Ivy League graduate program. Over time, my calls to them became less frequent, and their interest in my life was minimal at best. I told Lisa I was comfortable letting that relationship fade, focusing instead on building something positive together. Looking back, maybe I should have seen the red flags. Lisa seemed enthralled whenever I mentioned Connor. She'd casually ask about him, his studies, his career plans, his lifestyle, as if she was assembling a portrait of him in her mind. At the time, I brushed it off as harmless curiosity. I still clung to the belief that I'd finally escaped the endless comparisons that defined my youth. After all, Lisa chose me, not Connor. I allowed myself to trust that fact completely. Meanwhile, my career began taking off. I secured a new position at a renowned financial institution, and with it came a salary that put our previous incomes to shame. I felt on top of the world, convinced that my perseverance had led me to a well-deserved reward. Our wedding was a low-key ceremony, just the way we both wanted it. At least I thought so. We said our vows in front of a small group of friends and a few family members. Connor showed up, freshly graduated from his master's program. He was charming as ever, all smiles and witty remarks. I noticed Lisa watching him from across the room, an intensity in her eyes that I naively interpreted as friendly admiration. During the reception, she spent a fair amount of time talking to him about his recent trip to Europe, leaning in closer than I felt comfortable with, though I shrugged it off. I had spent my whole life ignoring the favoritism that overshadowed me, so ignoring a small pang of jealousy was nothing new. We moved on, Lisa and I, into our married life. The next few months were blissful, or so it seemed. I'd come home from work, exhausted but proud of the life I was building, to find Lisa cooking dinner or asking about my day. On weekends, we'd plan day trips, watch old movies on the couch, and talk about when we might want kids. She seemed so supportive, so present, that I couldn't imagine anything sinister lurking beneath the surface. And yet, in the back of my mind, I sometimes recalled the way she had looked at Connor. Maybe it was a holdover from my childhood insecurities, or maybe it was my intuition trying to warn me, but I ignored it completely, content in my domestic bubble. It was about a year into our marriage when the truth started to unravel. Lisa had grown distant, often texting in another room and saying it was work-related. She began slipping away on weekends, claiming she needed time to herself, or was going to meet an old friend from college. One afternoon, I came home early from an out-of-town business trip to surprise her, only to find a note saying she'd gone shopping. Her phone, however, was left behind in the living room, buzzing incessantly with notifications. Normally, I respected her privacy, but that day I felt compelled to look. What I discovered shattered every illusion I had. There were dozens of messages from Connor, peppered with affectionate language and explicit references to secret meetups. I stood there, reading texts that spoke of hotel reservations, their private jokes about me and the time they spent in my home when I was gone on business. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. The final blow was a photo, Connor kissing her cheek, both of them smiling in a way I hadn't seen her smile in months. My entire world collapsed in that instant. Every memory of our wedding, our shared dreams, and the plans we had made for the future crumbled into dust. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, tears burning my eyes, trying to process what I had done to deserve such betrayal from two people who had once vowed loyalty to me, one as my brother, the other as my wife. In that moment, fury replaced sorrow. I called Lisa immediately, demanding she return home. She offered a weak excuse, but I cut her off, telling her we needed to talk. When she finally arrived, I confronted her with the messages. She stared at me silently, tears brimming in her eyes, but I saw no genuine remorse. It was as if she was sorry only because she had been caught. We argued for hours, me demanding answers and her offering vague justifications about feeling neglected or drawn to Connor's charisma. Then came the admission that she was pregnant, and the baby wasn't mine. I heard the words, but they felt distant, like echoes in a dream I wanted to escape. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was merely delivering the news as though it were some unpleasant formality. I realized then that I was never going to be the center of her life, never going to compare to the golden child in her eyes. I packed a bag that same night, telling her I needed space. Her only response was a quiet apology, laced with desperation that felt more about preserving her image than actually caring for my pain. I left, checking into a nearby hotel, uncertain what to do next. The ring on my finger felt like a shackle, a cruel joke. The vow I had spoken at the altar was meaningless now, trampled on by the very person who was supposed to guard it with her life. I felt alone, but at the same time, weirdly liberated. Divorce proceedings began soon after. Lisa's betrayal was undeniable. Initially, she tried to object, claiming we could salvage what was left, but her arguments held no weight. She was pregnant with my brother's child, and any hope of reconciliation was nothing but a fool's dream. We settled matters swiftly. I kept most of what I had earned, and she left for an apartment she claimed Connor was helping her fund. The last I heard, they planned on making a life together. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I stopped paying attention. The divorce was final in 6 months, and during that time, I didn't hear a single word from my parents, not one phone call to ask if I was okay. They were too busy celebrating the upcoming grandchild, courtesy of their favored son. I felt an onslaught of bitterness, not just towards Lisa and Connor, but towards my entire family for treating me like I was disposable. Yet, part of me remained resolute. I wasn't going to let them define my worth anymore. With the legalities concluded, I threw myself back into work. I took on more responsibilities, spearheaded new projects, and in a twist of fate, I was promoted to a high-ranking position that came with a significant pay bump. Suddenly, I was making more money than I'd ever imagined. I upgraded my living situation, got myself a sleek new condo, and focused on personal growth. It felt like my life was finally turning a corner. Then, just when I was beginning to find stability in my new life, my phone rang one evening with an unknown number. I answered out of habit, and to my surprise, it was my mother. Her voice trembled with what sounded like forced affection, asking me how I was. I felt a jolt of anger but kept my tone neutral. She talked for a minute or two about mundane things, the weather, her health, before finally cutting to the chase. My father had retired recently, she said, and their finances were less stable than they'd hoped. The subtext was clear. They wanted my help. I clenched my jaw, recalling how they'd abandoned me during the most devastating period of my life. Now, with Connor apparently unemployed and Lisa staying home to care for their child, no extra funds were coming in. They heard I'd gotten a lucrative promotion and assumed I'd be willing, maybe even eager, to help the family out. She tried to sugarcoat the request, talking about how blood is thicker than water, how we all need to stick together. I could practically hear my father in the background prompting her to make sure I knew how desperate they were. It was astounding, really, to think they expected me to bail them out after ignoring me for so long. I remembered the nights I'd spent alone in that hotel room, the months of divorce proceedings, and the total silence from them through it all. My mother ended the call by suggesting I think about it, then let her know as soon as possible. I took a few days to wrestle with my anger. Part of me wanted to ignore them entirely, to repay indifference with indifference. But another part of me demanded something more decisive, a confrontation that would finally lay bare all the resentment I'd harbored. I decided to invite my parents and Connor to dinner at a fancy restaurant downtown. If they wanted my help, they would have to look me in the eye. They arrived together, looking uneasy. My father attempted a half smile, my mother looked painfully polite, and Connor, face drawn with anxiety, tugged at his shirt collar like it was choking him. As we sat down, I could see the tension etched into everyone's posture. They tried small talk at first, praising the restaurant choice and asking about my job. I entertained their questions but kept my answers curt. Then, after the server left us alone with our entrees, I told them to be straightforward about what they needed. My mother fumbled with her words, explaining that times were tough for Connor and Lisa, and that my parents' retirement fund was dwindling. My father cleared his throat awkwardly and suggested that maybe I could lend them a certain sum to cover essential expenses. Connor sat there, avoiding my gaze, swallowing hard every few seconds. They never mentioned Lisa by name, but everyone knew her presence loomed over the conversation like a dark cloud. I let them speak, listened to their pleas, and felt my rage simmer beneath a veneer of calm. When they finished, I leaned forward and asked if Connor had anything he wanted to say. He looked at me then, eyes full of shame, but he managed to utter a stiff apology. Something about mistakes being made, about him wanting us to reconcile as a family. I let him speak without interruption, noticing the way my parents nodded in agreement, as if this was something we could just move past. Finally, I placed my napkin on the table and told them about the sleepless nights I spent after discovering Lisa's betrayal. I described the sense of abandonment I felt when no one in my family reached out while I was fighting through the divorce. I told them how I had always known Connor was their favorite, how I watched them applaud his every move while ignoring mine. I explained that forgiveness was impossible for me because some betrayals run so deep they scar you permanently. My mother tried to protest, my father looked away, and Connor's face fell. I then informed them that I owed them nothing, not an ounce of pity, not a single dollar. Their pleas for help rang hollow in my ears. For once, I was in control and they had no leverage over me. I paid the bill, stood up, and told them I was done being their scapegoat. done with their hypocrisy, done pretending we were a real family. Then I walked out, leaving them all silent at the table. After that night, I half expected a barrage of phone calls or text messages, but they were eerily silent. Maybe they finally understood the depth of the wound they'd caused. Maybe they were too proud to beg again. Whatever the reason, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself further into work, traveling overseas for conferences and closing major deals. My boss noticed my dedication and increased my responsibilities once more, securing me a comfortable future. I found solace in my achievements, in the knowledge that I had risen above the circumstances designed to keep me down. Meanwhile, I met new people, formed friendships with colleagues who respected me for my abilities, not for who my brother was. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers through distant relatives about Connor struggling to find stable employment or Lisa complaining about her limited social life with a baby to care for. None of it stirred any sympathy in me. They had made their choices, and I was done cleaning up their mess. Some nights, I'd go for a run in my upscale neighborhood and reflect on how drastically my life had changed in just a few years. I had lost a wife, exposed my brother's true colors, and severed ties with the family that always undervalued me. Yet, I was surprisingly at peace. The betrayal no longer consumed me, it merely fueled my determination never to settle for less than I deserved. Months later, I was out for dinner with a business associate when I spotted Connor at a corner table, alone with a drink. He looked disheveled and far from the confident golden boy I once knew. Our eyes met then. He gave me a nod of acknowledgement, but I turned away. Later, in the parking lot, he approached me. He spoke about his regrets, about how everything had fallen apart with Lisa, and about their financial struggles. In a feeble voice, he asked if there was any chance I could help him find a job at my firm. I stood there for a long moment, remembering every wound inflicted upon me for years. I recalled the texts between him and my ex-wife, the child they brought into this world under the shadow of deceit. I thought of my parents begging for handouts, never once apologizing for how they treated me. And then I thought of my hard-earned accomplishments, everything I'd built despite their scorn. I kept my voice steady, telling him he was on his own. I would do nothing for him. Before he could protest, I got into my car and drove away, feeling a calm satisfaction that was neither cruel nor benevolent. It was justice. In that moment, I realized true closure doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from standing firm in one's self-respect. I had let go, and there would be no forgiveness. I remember the exact moment everything changed, though at the time it felt like a dream sequence in slow motion. It was late afternoon on a Tuesday, a day that should have been indistinguishable from any other, but it wasn't. The sun was drifting behind the clouds, painting the living room a shade of gray, reminiscent of my mood during those months of depression I was wading through. I was sitting on the couch, swirling lukewarm tea in a cheap mug, wishing I could muster the will to pour it down the drain and get on with my day. That's when my wife, Anna, told me, almost casually, she'd been sleeping with other men. There was an eerie calm in her voice as if she were discussing the weather. The words landed like a slap, yet I couldn't process them. I had suspected things were off for a while, but I'd been too lost in my own emotional fog to follow through on my suspicions. She was standing by the window, arms folded, wearing that old sweater I once found adorable. Now it only seemed to accentuate how detached she'd become. Her eyes drifted over our yard, and she let out a sigh before turning to me with a frown that I interpreted as self-pity. A wave of conflicting thoughts flooded my head, self-blame, heartbreak, confusion, and, somehow, relief. My world was spinning, but some detached corner of my mind told me I was no longer imagining things. This was real. "You haven't been yourself," she said, like she was explaining why she'd forgotten to buy groceries. "I tried to be there for you, but your depression was too much." I stared, feeling the fabric of the couch pressing into my back. I'd spent countless hours in that very spot, wrestling with dark moods, telling myself to hang on because Anna was my anchor. Hearing her words, I realized she had never been an anchor at all. She was the balloon that had slipped from my grasp, drifting wherever the wind took her, leaving me behind with no warning. My chest tightened, but instead of tears, I felt a coldness rising, a sense of clarity that was painfully overdue. "So you slept with other men because I was depressed," I said. My voice was hoarse, my hands trembled. I set down the mug so it wouldn't shatter. "And you're telling me this now?" She shrugged, a minimal gesture that made me want to laugh at its absurdity. "You shut me out. I had needs. You weren't there for me emotionally, so what was I supposed to do?" I could almost see the gears turning in her mind, seeking validation or hoping for a quick fix. Maybe she thought my depression was an all-purpose excuse that would let her walk away guilt-free. But I didn't have the energy to yell or demand details. I simply nodded, got up from the couch, and told her I needed time to think. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it. Maybe even she recognized that I was too numb for a shouting match. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet shock, drifting through my job at the local newspaper, doing the bare minimum so I wouldn't get fired. My editor, Tom, asked if everything was okay. I managed a half smile and lied about having insomnia. It wasn't entirely untrue. I was awake most nights anyway, staring at the ceiling, feeling betrayal's bitter taste. My depression was already a heavy weight, but discovering her affairs made it 10 times worse. I doubted everything: my worth, my sense of reality, my entire marriage. I tried to recall exactly when our relationship had begun to sour. We'd married young, she was 22 and I was 24. For a while, we were happy. I remembered road trips and quiet nights watching old movies, and I recalled the day we bought this house, painting the living room walls a pale blue together. But somewhere along the line, something changed. Life had piled on stress, job pressures, money woes, the creeping sense that we were drifting apart. While I sank into despair, she apparently found comfort in other men's arms. The realization made my stomach churn with a slow-burning fury. At first, I wrestled with the idea that maybe I'd driven her to it. In my darkest moments, I wondered if my depression was too great a burden. But then I remembered that in a marriage, you're supposed to stand by your partner, not run off and betray them. I had never lifted a hand to her. I'd never turned emotionally abusive. I'd just been sad, a heavy, soul-draining sadness, but still sadness. The more I examined it, the more I realized her betrayal went beyond a simple mistake. She'd made a choice. Multiple times, apparently, with multiple guys. The question was, who were these other men, and how long had this been going on? But to my own surprise, I discovered I wasn't even that curious. Learning specifics would only deepen the wound. All that mattered was that she had betrayed me, and she had the gall to blame me for it. A few nights after her confession, she approached me in the kitchen while I was making a sandwich, my first proper meal of the day. I'd been living off junk, too depressed to cook anything substantial. She leaned against the counter, looking exhausted. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know it's a lot to handle." I found that almost laughable, an apology accompanied by zero remorse in her voice. She was sorry for the inconvenience, but not the act. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a lot." She shifted her weight, fiddling with a loose thread on her sweater. "It just happened. I never set out to hurt you." When I didn't respond, she continued, "I still care about you, but we can't keep living like this. Maybe it's best we end things. It's not healthy for either of us." There it was, the quiet push toward divorce, delivered as if she was reading lines off some script. We had been drifting, yes, but that statement lit a spark of anger in me. I was dealing with a mental health crisis, and her solution was to cheat and then leave. Worse, she wanted me to believe it was my fault, as though my sadness had driven her into other men's beds. I stared at her, 1,000 replies tumbling through my mind, but I couldn't form a coherent sentence. Finally, I just nodded and closed the fridge door. I didn't sleep well that night. While she dozed in the guest room, she'd moved there to avoid awkwardness. I sat in bed plotting how to handle this. Divorce was messy, especially when it came to finances. I'd put so much of myself into this house, our joint accounts, everything. The rational side of me said, let it go, move on and rebuild your life. But there was another side, wounded and raw, that craved retribution. I was tired of being the victim. Deep down, I knew I wanted revenge. And not just a fleeting moment of satisfaction, I wanted her to feel what it was like to lose everything. The next morning, I drove to work like a zombie and tried to go about my day as if it were normal. On my lunch break, I began doing research, quietly, methodically. I read about divorce laws in our state, about how cheating could sometimes affect the settlement. I read about spousal support, contested divorces, and property division. Each article I consumed felt like a stepping stone across a raging river, carrying me closer to a shore where I was no longer helpless. By the time I clocked out, I had gathered a load of information, enough to see that if I played my cards right, I could make sure she walked away with next to nothing. I knew that I needed proof of her infidelity. A mere admission in the living room might not suffice in court. The next few days, as tension simmered in our household, I quietly compiled texts, emails, and bank statements. Anna had been sloppy. She'd used our joint bank account to fund dinners at fancy restaurants I had never visited. She'd sent suggestive messages to one of her flings from our home computer, forgetting to delete them from the outbox. It was all there, waiting for me to discover. Each new piece of evidence felt like a knife twisting in my gut, but it also hardened my resolve. No more self-doubt, no more letting her walk all over me. During those weeks, we drifted in a bizarre limbo. We were still living under the same roof, but we barely spoke. When we did, it was tense and clipped. Sometimes she would mutter apologies, sometimes she would rail at me about how I was making her feel guilty. Other times, she simply acted like it was none of my business if she went out late. Often, I sat in the living room, hunched over my laptop, while she left for a drive, returning hours later. I didn't bother to question it. Each time she left, I seized the opportunity to continue my investigation, meticulously organizing everything I found. Strangely enough, my depression started to lift, if only slightly. I had a renewed sense of purpose, twisted though it was. I began exercising again, forcing myself out for a jog after work. I even started sleeping a little better. Maybe it was the adrenaline from planning a thorough, calculated blow to someone who had shattered my trust. One night, as I was sorting through some new revelations on my laptop, an old friend, Marcus, called. He was concerned, having heard through mutual acquaintances that Anna and I were having problems. Normally, I would have brushed him off, but I found myself talking for over an hour, revealing the bare bones of what had happened. To my surprise, he didn't try to talk me out of my anger. Instead, he simply listened. "You gonna divorce her?" he finally asked. "Yeah," I replied. "I am. I'm done." "Then do what you have to do," he said, "but be careful. These things get ugly, fast." I thanked him for the advice, still determined to stay on course. If ugly was the price for reclaiming my dignity, I was willing to pay it. Time passed slowly. Anna and I continued our daily charade until, at last, she suggested we contact a divorce lawyer. She did it over dinner, an awkward affair consisting of leftover takeout. She shifted uncomfortably. "We should get the process started. I can't live in limbo." I sat back, locking eyes with her. Part of me wanted to say I couldn't stand the sight of her, but I held my tongue. "Fine," I said. "You pick a date to meet with someone, and I'll come along. Let's do it together so we know exactly where we stand." She seemed relieved I wasn't putting up a fight. "Thanks," she mumbled, pushing her carton aside. I had already secured my own attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Denise, who came highly recommended by a coworker. I'd briefed Denise on the entire situation, supplying her with the damning evidence of Anna's multiple affairs. When I told her I intended to ensure Anna got nothing, not even a portion of the house, Denise raised an eyebrow but nodded. "It's possible," she said, "especially with this proof. It'll hinge on how we frame the narrative." The day we finally sat down in a sterile conference room with Anna's lawyer, the tension was palpable. Anna's lawyer, a man with wire-rimmed glasses, tried to push the narrative that Anna was driven to cheat because I was emotionally unavailable. He spun it as though I'd failed her. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. Denise systematically dismantled his arguments, citing the texts and the hotel receipts. She carefully hinted that Anna had repeatedly violated the sanctity of our marriage. Anna's lawyer tried to object, but the evidence was right there, and the effect was immediate. Anna shrank in her seat, her face reddening. For the first time, I thought I saw something close to genuine shame in her eyes. When we reached the topic of splitting assets, Denise made it clear we were open to negotiations, but that if Anna wanted to press the issue, we'd contest everything in court. In our state, adultery could have serious repercussions on property division, particularly since we had no children. Anna squirmed, exchanging anxious looks with her attorney. The conversation ended with us agreeing to meet again after both parties had time to review the evidence in detail. On the drive home, Anna stared out the passenger window. She looked drained. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. I gripped the steering wheel. I think you know why. She turned to me, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to go this far. You just cheated on me while I was depressed, I snapped, my voice firm. And you blamed it on me. Did you expect me to pay you alimony after all that? She said nothing, and we completed the ride in silence. After we got home, she locked herself in the guest room and I retreated to the bedroom, my mind buzzing. I knew this was only the first round. In the end, either we'd settle or we'd battle it out in court. She had done real damage, and part of me was still stunned we were even in this situation, but I was determined to see it through, no matter how messy or prolonged it became. I decided to build an even stronger case. I rummaged through old receipts, credit card statements, and any trace of her various flings. I even managed to find a timeline that showed she'd had at least 3 different affairs in the span of 1 year. The darkest part of me wondered how she'd found the time. We'd lived under the same roof, eating breakfast together, acting like a normal couple. It was all so surreal, but the more evidence I found, the less doubt I had. She was not the woman I'd thought I married. Meanwhile, rumors started spreading among our friends. Some took her side, pitying her predicament of having a depressed spouse. Others sided with me, most simply didn't know what to say. I began avoiding social gatherings. I couldn't handle the judging eyes or the well-intentioned concern. Instead, I focused on my job, on exercise, and on my single-minded pursuit of justice in that divorce. One evening, I came home to find Anna in the living room, pacing. She looked anxious, biting her lip. When I closed the door, she turned to face me, tears brimming. I want to settle, she blurted. I can't keep going back and forth. Let's just do it quickly. I didn't even blink. What's your proposal? She hesitated. I'll waive alimony, but I want half the equity in the house. We can sell it and split the proceeds. That's not going to happen, I said calmly. You can move out. I'm not selling. She scoffed, tears drying as anger took over. You can't do that to me. I've lived here too. I shrugged. Yes, you did, but you chose to violate our marriage. I'm willing to negotiate to avoid a lengthy court battle, but that negotiation doesn't include giving you half of everything. You didn't earn it. She glared at me, but I think she already sensed she was cornered. All the evidence we had meant her leverage was practically non-existent. She stormed away, slamming the guest room door so hard the walls shook. I locked myself in my study, pacing until midnight. The anger, once a suffocating presence, was now fueling me. I wouldn't give in, not an inch. If she wanted a fight, she would get it. Over the following weeks, negotiations escalated. Her lawyer tried to bully us into some compromise, suggesting that I was petty and vindictive. Each time, Denise coolly pointed to the evidence of repeated adultery. Eventually, Anna's lawyer realized they were in a losing position. We set a date to finalize the divorce papers. By that point, Anna was barely speaking to me. I was fine with that. My depression, ironically enough, had lessened. I still felt sadness, but it was overshadowed by a grim determination to see this through. On the morning we were scheduled to finalize everything, I woke up feeling oddly calm. It was a crisp autumn day. The leaves in our yard had turned golden brown. I dressed in a simple suit, swallowed a piece of toast, and made my way to the lawyer's office. Anna drove herself in a separate car. Inside that conference room, the atmosphere was tense, but there was an air of conclusion. We signed the papers. She ended up with her personal belongings, her car, and a small settlement that was barely enough to start over. I'd fought tooth and nail to ensure she got as little as possible beyond that, and Denise had come through brilliantly. No alimony, no claim to the house, nothing else. As she penned her signature, Anna refused to look at me, tears dripping onto the stack of legal documents. I watched her hand tremble, and though a distant part of me felt pity, my resolve was stronger. She'd made her choices, now she had to live with them. When the pen's final scratch echoed in the room, it was over. We were no longer married. The lawyers shook hands, and Anna stood up stiffly, refusing to meet my eyes. I hope you're happy, she said. I remained silent as she walked out. Once she was gone, Denise turned to me with a small nod. You got what you wanted. Yeah, I said quietly. Thank you. I stepped outside, the cool breeze hitting me. A sense of finality weighed on my chest. I realized my life was mine again, to shape however I pleased. That night, I returned to the house, now my house, and sat on the couch in the silent living room. There was no sense of triumph. There was just relief, mingled with the faint echo of betrayal's sting. For a while, I tried to settle back into normalcy. I began therapy for my depression, something I should have done sooner. I told my therapist about the divorce, about the cheating. She said all the usual lines about forgiveness and personal growth, but I cut her short. I don't forgive her, I told her, and I don't plan to. I just want to move on. The therapist nodded, scribbling notes, and accepted my stance. Sometimes that was all the validation I needed, that it was okay not to forgive someone who'd broken me in a time of vulnerability. A few months passed. The house felt empty, but also comforting in its quiet. I replaced the furniture in the living room, throwing out the old couch and repainting the walls a neutral cream. My heart still fluttered with a kind of dull ache whenever I recalled the betrayal, but I found ways to cope. I started writing more. I threw myself into reporting assignments, even volunteering for late-night shifts. I reached out to some old friends, reconnecting with a part of myself I'd neglected. One day, I ran into Anna by accident at a local coffee shop. She was sitting alone, staring at her phone with an expression that hinted at stress. I almost walked away, but she glanced up and spotted me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. She looked thinner, and the spark of confidence that once defined her was gone. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I didn't. I had changed. I wasn't the broken man she remembered. She stood, smoothing her coat. "Hi," she murmured. "Hi," I replied. She lowered her gaze. How are you?" I shrugged. "I'm managing." An awkward silence settled, pregnant with things we'd never say. Finally, she said, "I just want you to know, I never hated you. I was just lost." I forced a nod. I wasn't about to comfort her. She'd done more than enough damage. She swallowed hard. "I know I hurt you. I know you hate me now. But for what it's worth, I am sorry." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. There was no desire in me to console her or tell her I understood. Instead, I said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then I left, stepping out into the cold day. I felt no sympathy for her struggles. Once upon a time, I might have, but not now. I'd built a fortress around my heart where her memory was concerned. She would never step inside it again. That night, I thought about our encounter. I felt an odd sense of peace. I realized I had no regrets. I had done what I needed to do to reclaim my life, even if part of it had been fueled by bitterness. Some might call it petty, but for me, it was an affirmation of self-worth, an acknowledgement that I deserved better than to be someone's doormat. I think we all have a breaking point, and Anna had pushed me past mine. Life continued, each day a small step forward. I discovered new routines, ventured on solo trips, and found a measure of solace in solitude. My friends noticed I was opening up more, sharing jokes and stories like I used to. Marcus and I started going hiking on weekends, and I embraced the outdoors as a balm for my lingering emotional scars. My therapist, too, noticed the shift. She said I was making progress, that channeling anger into constructive pursuits was healthy as long as I recognized when to let go of the venom. Little did I know I was in for one last twist, a final piece of unpredictability that would remind me life rarely follows neat scripts. One morning, months after the divorce, I was surprised to find a letter in my mailbox. It was from Anna, mailed from a neighboring town. My initial instinct was to tear it up, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, hands trembling slightly, and began reading. She wrote that she had been seeing a psychiatrist for several weeks. Her life had spiraled after the divorce. She'd lost friends, crashed on a friend's couch, and was deeply unhappy. She confessed that she'd been trying to understand her own self-destructive behavior. She wrote that she accepted full responsibility for her actions and that she didn't blame me for taking everything. And then, like a sucker punch, she revealed she had been diagnosed with a personality disorder that might have contributed to her impulsive, harmful decisions. She didn't offer this as an excuse, she insisted, but rather as an explanation for why she had sabotaged her own marriage and then tried to shift the blame onto me. She ended by saying she wasn't expecting forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she'd finally recognized the gravity of what she'd done and that she was determined to work on herself. She wished me happiness and thanked me for the years we'd had together before things fell apart. I stood in my kitchen, letter in hand, absorbing the words. A swirl of emotions took hold: anger, pity, confusion, relief. But through it all, one thought stood out. I still had no intention of forgiving her. She had her reasons, and they might have been tragic, but she'd burned every bridge. My acceptance of her apology would not change the past. And so I folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer, and carried on with my day. For a moment, I considered calling her, telling her I was glad she was seeking help. But then I remembered how I'd felt when she stood in our living room and blamed my depression for her infidelity. I remembered all the nights I'd lain awake, the tears I'd shed, the self-loathing and questions. No, I thought, she could seek her redemption alone. It wasn't my responsibility to give her the closure she needed. In time, the memory of that letter faded. I let other parts of my life take center stage. My work at the paper improved. My editor even promoted me to a senior position. I found new hobbies. I took a photography class and started capturing images of the city's hidden corners. My new sense of purpose, unburdened by a toxic relationship, fueled me. Occasionally, I encountered reminders of Anna. A mutual friend would mention her name in passing, or I'd stumble across an old photograph. Each time, I felt that flicker of pain, but it was weaker than before. I'd made sure she walked away with nothing, and that knowledge, while it might sound cruel, gave me a sense of justice served. I didn't hate her, but I also didn't pity her. She was just a figure in my past, a lesson learned the hard way. Some nights, I stared out my window at the moonlight casting shadows across my yard, recalling how desperately alone I'd felt when my depression was at its worst. But now, there was a faint glow in my chest telling me I was stronger than before. I had survived betrayal, the messy divorce, the emotional roller coaster, and I was still here, standing on my own 2 feet. I can't say there was some grand epiphany at the end of all this. Life is rarely that neat. But there was a moment, a small one, when I realized I genuinely liked the person I was becoming. I'd been forced out of my comfort zone, forced to fight for my dignity, and in the process, I uncovered a backbone I didn't know I had. Maybe that was the closest thing to a silver lining, learning to respect myself enough to stand up to someone who had trampled my trust. It's been over a year now since the divorce was finalized. My therapist still encourages me to seek closure, but I find that closure doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes, closure means recognizing something is broken and allowing it to stay that way, refusing to pretend it never happened. I moved forward by focusing on what lies ahead, not by granting absolution to someone who never valued me when it mattered. Last month, I finished renovating the guest room Anna once occupied. I repainted the walls a gentle sage green and replaced the worn carpet with hardwood. Standing there, I remembered the nights she slept in that small space, how we were strangers under the same roof. Now, it's just another room in my home, a place I might turn into an office or a studio for my photography. The ghosts remain in the echoes, but they're quieter now, less threatening. Looking back, I still feel a hint of surprise at the path everything took. If you had asked me years ago how I would handle infidelity, I might have answered with a shrug, claiming I'd forgive and move on because life's too short. But that was before I'd tasted the bitterness of betrayal so intimately. In that moment of deepest hurt, my sense of self-preservation demanded more than just walking away. It demanded justice. Some might call it revenge, and maybe that's accurate, but I see it more as a firm assertion of my own worth. She broke the vows we made, and in so doing, forfeited any right to my mercy. The day our divorce was signed, I stood in that conference room, pen in hand, heart pounding. Part of me doubted if I was doing the right thing by showing no leniency. Yet, when I looked across the table and remembered the months of deception, the lonely nights, and her cold declaration that my depression justified her affairs, my doubt dissolved. In that moment, I realized that sparing her wouldn't spare me any pain. I had to walk away knowing I'd held her accountable. And so here I am, writing this in the quiet of my study. The air is cool, the leaves are gone from the trees, and winter is creeping in. I glance at the spot on my shelf where I keep a small memento, a keychain from our wedding day. I found it in a box of old stuff and didn't have the heart to throw it out. It's the only piece of our marriage I saved, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of how much can change and how vital it is to protect one's sense of self. If you're wondering whether I'm bitter, I'd say not anymore. Anger was the fuel that got me through one of the darkest chapters of my life, but it slowly burned out, leaving room for a more grounded perspective. I'm grateful I defended myself when I was vulnerable, grateful I pursued a fair, or perhaps ruthless settlement, and grateful I didn't let her excuses sway me into thinking I was the reason for her betrayal. Because that's the crucial point. No one else is responsible for our choices. She made hers, and I made mine in response. Sometimes I think about how depression can warp your view of yourself and the world. It can make you cling to the hope that people will show you kindness in your darkest hour. But it can also sharpen your instincts when that kindness isn't there. If I hadn't been so low, maybe I would have confronted her sooner, or maybe I would have walked away before marriage even came into the picture. It doesn't matter now. All I know is that pain can be transformative, and though I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, I can't deny it forced me to grow. I don't know what Anna's life looks like now. The last I heard, she was renting a small apartment and trying to find stable work. I hope she's taking her therapy seriously for her sake, but also to ensure she doesn't destroy someone else's life down the road. As for me, I've entertained the idea of dating again, though I move cautiously, aware that trust is not something I hand out freely anymore. I still have nightmares occasionally, but fewer than before. Most mornings, I wake up ready to face the day, feeling like maybe there's a future out there that doesn't revolve around betrayal or revenge. People often say that the best revenge is living well. I used to think that was just a cliche, but I've come to see the wisdom in it. Ensuring Anna walked away with nothing gave me a sense of immediate justice, but the real prize is the life I'm building in the aftermath. Every laugh with friends, every new achievement at work, every hobby I explore, those are the things that truly leave the bitterness behind. She can't touch that part of me anymore. She never will. And that, ultimately, is what keeps me going. I've reclaimed my life, shaped it in a way that honors my value, and learned that sometimes not forgiving is perfectly acceptable if it helps you heal. If Anna taught me anything, it's that there's a line no one should ever cross: using another person's pain as an excuse for your own betrayal. She crossed that line, and I have zero regrets about ensuring she paid the price. Though you never truly erase a painful past, you can transform it into fuel for a better tomorrow. And that's exactly what I did. I found a reason to keep going, despite it all. And in the quiet moments when I close my eyes, I tell myself the truth. I deserved more than she was willing to give, and it took her darkest betrayal for me to finally see my own worth. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who fought for himself when it mattered most, and who won